In this lecture, we're going to take a look at the protists, the eukaryotic microorganisms that are all unicellular. And so here we go. So protists, as we mentioned before, are not a monophyletic group. So when we go to look at their DNA, we can see that they are not united in their evolution. And so it's a group that is at the moment being worked out as we can look and sequence DNA. And what we're seeing is that there are many kingdoms within this group that we refer to as protist. But there are some characteristics that bind them all together, and that includes that they are unicellular, although some of them can be colonial as well, with colonies that have multiple cells in them. They're eukaryotic, which means that they have nuclei and membranous organelles, and they tend to be very small, anywhere from 5 microns to 5 millimeters. So pretty small little guys. So while they are small, they play huge and very important roles in the environment, and they can be very, very important to humans. They serve, from an ecological perspective, they serve a wide variety of roles in the environments. They are some of them are autotrophic as producers, so they're out there photosynthesizing, getting energy from the sun and bringing in the energy into food webs. Many of them are heterotrophic consumers, so they're out there preying on some of these autotrophic ones or on other consuming protists. And then they act as decomposers in the environment as well, breaking down organic material into smaller particles and reducing the amount of waste that's lying around. We can find ancient protists, or the remains of ancient protists, in limestone and in a material called diatomaceous earth. Diatoms are a planktonic photosynthetic protist, and they have this glassy test or shell that they make around their bodies, and when they die in the just unimaginable numbers, in the billions and billions and trillions, then their test, that shell, falls to the bottom of the ocean and creates this ooze of these really scratchy kind of shell things. And we go and mine that stuff, and we use it in cleansers and in toothpaste and lots of different ways. The White Cliffs of Dover here are the remains of the calcium carbonate shells of other single cellular plankton that as they die, they also fall to the bottom. So the White Cliffs of Dover that's in England, kind of facing out toward France. And when England, the land that is England, was lifted up from the ocean floor, it pushed up all of this limestone that had formed from the shells of, again, countless numbers of these single-celled marine protists. Dinoflagellates are another group of protists, and they produce some pretty significant toxins in the form of red tide. And here's a red tide event. Here's a picture of one, and you can see why they call it red tide. There's so many of these dinoflagellate plankton in the water that they stain the water red. That may be the source of the there are some who have speculated that when Moses was performing his miracles in front of Pharaoh and the Nile waters turned to blood, that it may have been a red tide event that was being referenced in the Bible there. And they produce these nasty toxins that affect vertebrates. They don't affect invertebrates, and so the shellfish that are filter feeding on these dinoflagellates will accumulate that toxin in their bodies, and then we go and eat raw oysters, for instance, and can come down with a disease called paralytic shellfish poisoning, which is about as horrible as it sounds. And so these blooms or red tide events or intense growth of protists like this can even block the sun and kill any any plants or animals that are underneath that bloom that are relying on sunlight, or the grasses maybe that are growing underwater as food. And as those dead animals and plants decompose, then oxygen levels decrease, and that causes even more death. And so we see this sort of non-virtuous cycle of what's referred to as eutrophication, where a lot of nutrients build up in the environment, and it becomes this like choked, toxic stew of nastiness, and everything dies. And then last of all, the parasitic protists kill or debilitate hundreds of thousands of people worldwide every year. And so there's some pretty significant effects of protists in the human world. So when we look to classify protists, we can group them by some of the characteristics that they're capable of. And so there are plant-like protists. We refer to these as algae, and they can be broken down into euglenoids, diatoms, and dinoflagellates. Those are three groups of photosynthesizing protists. There are the fungus-like protists, and so they are frequently the decomposers. And so they are the water molds and the slime molds. We'll take a look at them. And then there are the animal-like protists, which are sometimes referred to as protozoa. And four groups there that I want you to be familiar with: the mastigophorans, the amoebozoa, the apicomplexans, and the ciliates. So here we go. We'll start with the algae. Algae are photosynthetic. They use chloroplasts for this. And if you look on page square, the algae in the book. Okay, so I'm not finding them. I was thinking there were some pictures in the book. Maybe that's why I don't have any pictures, is because I did not take the time to go out and try to find some. But you can look up algae. If you want to see some pictures, then I encourage you to look through, just go to Google and Google algae and do an image search, and you'll see some of the beauty that is the algae. Especially, I would encourage you to look for one called Volvox, Volvox. That guy is gorgeous. There's a whole group of them. So really encourage you to go out and look there. They're found in watery to moist and require sunny environments. They have cell walls. The cell walls are made out of cellulose. And they're mobile, many of them, with one or two flagella. So again, I want to encourage you to go and check those out on the internet. The next group of the plant-like protists are the euglenoids. Euglena have a single flagellum, and one thing that is characteristic with the euglenoids, especially in Euglena, so here is Euglena species, Euglena, Euglena. They have a structure called a stigma. It's a pigmented region of their cell that acts as an eye spot. They certainly aren't making image. They don't form images with this, but they can distinguish light from dark, and they tend to orient toward the light so that they can increase their photosynthetic capability. Rather than having a cell wall around them, they have a membranous structure external to their cell membrane called a pellicle, and so no cell wall on the euglenoids. Their normal mode of reproduction is binary fission, so they do very similar to what bacteria do, where they just pinch in two after having produced a copy of their DNA. And we usually find the euglenoids in freshwater, but they can also live in really moist soils as well, but primarily a freshwater group. And then the last of the plant-like protists are the diatoms. Diatoms also are photosynthetic, and their cell wall has this very loosely attached structure called a test. So what you're seeing here and here are the tests of the diatoms, which is like this little shell. It's almost like a little pillbox. If you look at it from the side, oh, come on. There we go. It looks like this. So when they're reproducing, one cell gets one half of the test, the other cell gets the other half, and they produce a new test to mate or to match the old test that they have. And the test may be composed of silica or of calcium carbonate. Many of them lack flagella, so they may not, they don't have a way to weakly kind of motivate themselves around. But they are planktonic, so they remain up in the water column. They're light enough that they don't fall out. The tests can accumulate as the diatoms die, and they can fossilize in super thick layers, forming limestone or that stuff called diatomaceous ooze that I was telling you about. And they, in marine environments, they are an important what we describe as a primary producer. So they're out there photosynthesizing, bringing energy into the ecosystem that then consumers will come along and munch on them and take their energy into their own bodies. Okay, so those are the plant-like protists. Oh, I'm sorry, one more group of plant-like protists, the dinoflagellates. Dino meaning whirling, and flagellates because they have flagella on them. So they have two flagella. One of them trails behind the organism, and then the other lays in this groove. You can see the groove here in their membrane. And some species may or may not have a cell wall around them, but many or some of them possess a non-cell wall, but a secreted layer of cellulose called a theca. So cell walls or theca or no cell wall at all, depending on the group. And they're second only to diatoms for their ability to do primary production. So dinoflagellates are another of the really important producers that are photosynthesizing and converting the physical energy of sunlight into chemical energy that can be consumed by other organisms. And then that last of all, they have a really cool ability. They can bioluminesce. And so here I would again send you either to YouTube. YouTube is best for this one because if you look up bioluminescent dinoflagellates, you'll see some really, really beautiful video. Because wouldn't you disturb them? So yeah, just to give you a little bit of an idea, and I used to go back when I lived in Florida. We would go to the beach and camp out and go for a night swim, and it's amazing. It's like you're covered in this sparkly mesh of really amazing stuff as these things start to glow in a dark night as you're swimming in the water and stand up and the water comes pouring off of you and it sparkles. It's really incredible. Encourage you to do that too if you ever get to the beach in the summer. Go for a night swim and you'll see some of these especially on a really dark night, you'll see these bioluminescent dinoflagellates doing their thing. Okay, so now the fungus-like protists, and we'll start with the water molds. And these include mold and mildew, like we think of in our homes or shower stalls and, the gross stuff. And a disease that affects mostly plants called blight. So late blight is an example of a water mold. So when they do asexual reproduction, they produce these flagellated zoospores, and they can swim in water droplets and distribute it to new areas, and they germinate and then grow, which is kind of cool. So that's asexual reproduction. When it's time to do sexual reproduction, then the asexual cells will produce large swimming gametes that will then fuse to form a new diploid cell. So with sexual reproduction, they make these really large cells that are capable of swimming. They find a cell to fuse with and then produce a new diploid cell. So asexual, we're looking at diploid organisms that then, when they do sexual reproduction, have to undergo meiosis, the process of producing a haploid gamete. We find them in freshwater and as plant parasites. So grapes, if you're growing grapes to make wine with, then downy mildew is one of the diseases you have to contend with. and that is a water mold. Late blight that I mentioned on potatoes and tomatoes. When your tomato plants, it's like July, your tomato plants are growing great. You're looking forward to August when you're going to get all these tomatoes, and then in a week, your tomatoes go black. Like the whole plant, everything just black, begins to wilt and is black, and that's late blight that has taken them down. And then there are some fish diseases that are caused by water molds as well. But for human health, there's very little significance related to water molds. It's mostly more of an agricultural issue. The slime molds are super interesting, and you may have seen slime molds. Physarum is the one that we see around. Physarum. It frequently in mulch. If you ever see an orange or a yellow, like puffy, foamy-looking stuff growing on a mulched bed, that's the slime mold Physarum doing its thing. These guys are saprophytic, which means that they feed on dead or dying material. So that's why we find them in mulch, because that's just plant material that's already dead. And they then, like fungi do, they will digest extracellularly and then import into their body the nutrients that they're digesting. So there are two kinds of slime molds. There are the plasmodial slime molds and the cellular slime molds. Plasmodial slime molds are crazy because the individual cells will merge and they form these enormous multinucleate, foamy-looking amoeboid masses that can crawl across, kind of ooze maybe would be a better term. They're not moving where you could watch them move, but if you set up a time-lapse camera, and again, YouTube, time-lapse camera, the plasmodial slime molds, super cool to see. And so they move around and they will phagocytize dead material and digest it and import all the nutrients. And then eventually they will form, as the area gets dry or as they start to run out of food, they form a structure called the fruiting body that has sporangia on it. The sporangia are their spore-producing structures, and as the spores germinate, and they produce spores. The spores then will be dispersed by wind or you coming along and kicking at this dried up, kind of now not very colorful mass. You walking along and you get a little puff of spores that will be distributed on the wind, and when they germinate, then they form gametes that as they fuse will produce again a new plasmodium that will crawl around on a moist mulch bed or some other location, digesting as they go. The cellular slime molds produce a similar structure, but rather than being a multinucleate kind of one cell with lots of nuclei, one huge cell with lots of nuclei, they remain cellular. And they will all kind of gang together and they form this slug-like pseudoplasmodium. And this slug-like thing can crawl around, digesting as it goes, and eventually it'll form a fruiting body. Here's the fruiting body. This, by the way, is the plasmodium of a plasmodial slime mold. This is what's left of the plasmodium after it forms a fruiting, or the pseudoplasmodium, I should say, after it forms its fruiting body. And then up here at the top, there's the sporangia that will produce the spores. And again, as it dries, the spores are released and they will germinate, and then rather than like finding each other and fusing, they will be individual amoeboid cells that grow and divide, and they're little amoeba that go crawling around. But once again, as the food runs dry, or as it begins to dry out, the cells will, at some signal, they will aggregate together and form this slug-like thing that goes crawling around and eventually finds a good place to attach. And that slug-like thing is the pseudoplasmodium, and then it will produce another of these fruiting bodies to produce a spore. Okay, so we'll wrap up by talking about the protozoa. Protozoa are all heterotrophic. They're primarily unicellular, but there are some that are colonial. Most of them are free-living, although some are commensal with other organisms. So commensal is a term that means that they live in or on the other organism, without harming them. And then a few are parasites, where they're living together with another organism and they're actually harming it as they are living. So the reason that coral are really colorful, or that giant clams have beautiful colored patterns in them, is because of the protozoa that live in their bodies. Wait, no, I take that back. Strike what I just said. Pretend it wasn't said at all. Those are some of the algae that provide that sort of color in corals and in the giant clams. So I take that back. So most are free living, but some of them are living with and around other organisms. Many of them are either aquatic, so freshwater, or marine, that's saltwater. And as conditions become unfavorable, so as things get really cold or as the little pond that they're in begins to dry up, then they may insist, so they may form into a resistant structure called a cyst, and that will help them to survive that dry time or the cold time, and then they break out of their cyst and continue living once conditions become more appropriate. Some of them are protected by a tough outer layer called a pellicle. So you've seen theca if it's in the algae, and a pellicle if it's in the protozoa. And many of them are motile, so they actually have directional, moving capability, swimming or kind of oozing along capability. So the mastigopherans include some of the human parasites. So trypanosoma, that is a blood parasite that causes African sleeping sickness. Leishmania, or Leishmania, Leishman is the person's name that it was named after, causes a disease called leishmaniasis, which leads to the development of skin lesions and fevers. Giardia, we think of that as like the hiker's diarrhea. So if you drink water that hasn't been filtered or purified in some way, then you can come down with Giardia. Most surface waters in the U.S. Are infected with Giardia. And Trichomonas, which is a protozoan that lives in the mucous membranes, or feasting on the mucous membranes, primarily of the vagina, causing trichomoniasis. There are some that live in symbiosis with plants or other animals. So one of those is the termite endosymbiont Trichonympha. So Trichonympha is a protozoan, and it is what's capable of digesting the cellulose in the plant material, in the wood, that termites eat. So without Trichonympha, termites are incapable of digesting cellulose, and so they couldn't survive eating on the wood of your house. They are all flagellated. Some of them are free-living in aquatic and marine habitats as well, of the mastigopherans. So these are the ones that microbiology is, or some of the ones that microbiology is most interested in, but or around human health, certainly, because of their parasitic and disease-causing nature. So the amoebozoans, these are the guys that are the amoebae, and they use structures called pseudopodia that they can move around in. So if this is an amoeboid or amoeba cell, there's a nucleus here, they can kind of pooch out their cell membrane. They can force their cytoplasm contents to move into this pooched out area, and then they crawl around by cytoplasmic streaming, it's called. Cytoplasmic streaming. And that is worth looking at in YouTube too. If you just Google amoeba, you can watch them kind of oozing and crawling around. They feed on other microbes by surrounding them. So if there's microbes, or they can feed on other protists as well. So their pseudopodia can kind of encircle a chunk of something that they want to eat. And as they stream around it, then the cell meets the cell membrane, and those two membranes will fuse. So where I've just scratched it out, you should pretend like you can't see anything there. And now we have a food vacuole inside of the amoeba and it can digest it. And so there's a great video online of amoeba eating protists. So maybe I'll show some of those to you this evening. Some of them are capable of living in the human gut, and if they do, they cause a disease called amoebic dysentery. And so there's a number of different parasitic amoebae that live in the human gut. Entamoeba, dientomoeba, endolimax, and iodamoeba are all capable of causing the condition that we think of as amoebic dysentery. So lots and lots of diarrhea, gastrointestinal distress, and pain. And it can be deadly, this amoebic dysentery, because you wind up becoming so dehydrated that people will die. Apicomplexans are primarily parasitic. I don't know of any non-parasitic ones, and they are immobile, so they don't crawl around or move around. At one end of the cell, what we think of as their apices, so if you think about a triangle, so that's an apex. There are three apexes or apices to a triangle. So at the tips of the cells, they have these complexes of organelles that are filled with enzymes. And so this is a protozoan that can digest its way into host cells, which is just really crazy. Super complex life cycles. They have multiple stages with multiple hosts. I will not ask you to try to learn or understand these really, really super complex life cycles, but know that they travel through many hosts, and some that are at issues for humans. There's Plasmodium. That is, I can't believe I didn't write that. That one is Malaria. Actually, I said I wouldn't ask you to know it, but I do want you to have a sense, at least, of the malarial life cycle. So it's a relatively simple one. So Plasmodium causes the disease malaria. So they infect, the Plasmodium will burrow into, using their apicomplexes, they will dissolve their way into a red blood cell, and inside the red blood cell they reproduce. They're safe from our white blood cells that would be trying to track them down because they're inside a human cell, so they're kind of disguised in there. And then they all come bursting out of the red blood cells, generally all at the same time. And it's when they're breaking up the red blood cells and all the larvae are being released into the blood that people come down with the fever and the chills that we associate with malaria. And so on something like a 33 or 36 hour kind of cycle, people will go through these bouts of fever and chills as more larvae are being released into the blood and red blood cells are being destroyed. And then everything goes quiet again while the larvae while the Plasmodium are inside the red blood cells, and then they burst out again like 36 hours later. I forget what the life cycle is, but it's something like that. So it's pretty awful, and deadly. Toxoplasma gondii. Cats are one of their hosts, and the rodents that cats eat are another of their hosts. So it's crazy. Toxoplasma actually causes rats and mice to lose their fear of bright light and movement, and so the toxoplasma get into the brain of the rodents, and they kind of take over their brain, and they become these zombies that go find cats and say, "Here, eat me." And so the cat eats the mouse or the rat, and now it's infected with toxoplasma, and then goes and poops in the cat box, and now there are toxoplasma larvae that are in the poo in the cat box, and pregnant women will go and change the cat box, and then they get infected with toxoplasma and don't even know it because there's not a lot of symptoms in humans. But what then happens is they're carrying a baby, there can be teratogenic effects. I'd say that there's not a lot of effects. It does actually, let me take that back. So it can cause blindness in adults and a lymphatic infection, but frequently women who have toxoplasma don't know that they've been infected. Okay, so here we see the life cycle of the malaria parasite. Sorry, I accidentally unplugged my computer. Here's the life cycle of the malaria parasite. It's found in the salivary glands of the mosquito. The mosquito comes and bites you. Now it introduces the sporozoites into the blood. They take up residence in the liver. They go through some life cycle stages as merozoites in the liver, and then they're released into the blood. They then take up residence inside of red blood cells, forming trophozoites. The trophozoites reproduce, forming more merozoites, which are released into the blood and infect more red blood cells, and over and over and over again. And you have this round of fever and chills, and some of them then produce these structures called gametocytes, cells that act as gametes. Those, when a mosquito bites you, the mosquito now has them inside the body. They are fertilized and they form a zygote, which then makes its way to the salivary glands again, and you're ready to get more sporozoites being delivered to the next human host. So it's this back and forth, found primarily in tropical areas. So in Florida, maybe South Texas, tropical wet areas where mosquitoes are common. And then certainly throughout equatorial regions that are wet, you would find malaria and plasmodium. And so if you do any traveling to foreign countries then that are in the tropics, very likely you'll be having to take medication to prevent you from getting plasmodium. Okay, the third of the animal-like protists are the ciliates. These are cells that are covered with cilia all over them, so they can have hundreds of thousands of cilia on them. The cilia are used to swim around or used to gather food, so they create currents that bring food into a region where they do a lot of endocytosis using their cilia, for instance. Most of them are freshwater, and because of that, because they've got lots of dissolved materials inside their cells, they're frequently getting water flooding in, and they have structures called contractile vacuoles that are constantly pumping fresh water out of their cells as well, so that they don't wind up having their cells burst. They have a pellicle on them, and it may be reinforced to help to withstand that osmotic stress. They can have these structures called trichocysts, which are little tentacles that are released and then kind of wrap around prey and help to bring them close so that they can endocytose their prey. And they may even have little stalks, like little butt ends, that help them to attach to substrate, so that they can stay in one place. They are capable of undergoing conjugation, where this is not sexual reproduction, but they just kind of bump up against each other, and then they can exchange bits of genetic material, frequently as plasmids. And the only ciliate that is a human parasite causing human diseases is Balantidium coli. Coli, so we know that has something to do with the digestive system, colon. Balantidium coli causes dysentery, so it's another organism that causes extreme diarrhea, loss of body fluids, and potentially death because of dehydration.